There are nights in Mexico when the mountains feel like walls, not because they're tall, but because they're silent. In the pine-covered highlands of Jalisco, the air can cut like glass. Every footstep crunches, every engine echoes. And on one particular night, February 22nd, 2026, Mexico's armed forces were hunting a man the world had chased for years. A man the U.S. government once placed a multi-million-dollar reward on. A man whose organization was accused of feeding America's synthetic drug crisis. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho. For more than a decade, he existed as a shadow with a name. A kingpin people whispered about often without ever seeing a clear, recent photo. A leader accused of commanding a cartel that moved like a military unit and hit like a storm. Then came the reports. A firefight, casualties, a man gravely wounded, and within hours roadblocks burning across highways. Vehicles torched like warning signs. If those reports were true, it meant something historic. It meant the man many authorities called Mexico's most powerful cartel leader was finally gone. But before we get to the end, we have to understand the beginning. Because El Mencho's story is not just about one man, it's about poverty, migration, prisons, alliances, betrayal, and an era when cartels evolved into paramilitary empires. Official records and reporting differ on some early details, birthplace, even timelines. But across most accounts, one theme is constant. El Mencho's origin story begins in rural Mexico, with very little. Many profiles place his birth in the mid to late 1960s. Some reports name July 17, 1966, in a small community tied to Aguililla, Michoacán. Other sources list different birthplaces or surrounding areas. What doesn't change is the landscape. Fields, orchards, hard soil, harder work. In places like Aguililla, childhood often ends early, not because kids want it to, but because survival demands it. School is a luxury when your family needs hands in the field. Accounts say Nemesio left school young, around primary grades, then worked agricultural labor. And in regions where illegal crops have long existed alongside legal agriculture, young men are exposed early to a second economy. It's important to say this carefully. Not everyone in these communities joins organized crime. Most don't, but the presence of illicit crops, armed guards, and cash changes the atmosphere. It changes what people think is possible. Some reports allege he was guarding marijuana fields as a teenager, whether that began at 14 or later. The point is that crime wasn't a distant rumor. It was local, it was visible, and for some more profitable than honest work could ever be. But there's another force that shaped his generation. A force that pulled people north across deserts, rivers, and borders. In the 1980s, migration to the United States wasn't just a choice. It was a plan for survival. Factories, farms, construction sites. For many, the U.S. meant hard work, but work that could change a family's future. Multiple accounts say Nemesio entered the United States illegally and lived in California. Some sources mention the San Francisco Bay Area, and some report he used aliases, names like Rubén Avila. But here's where the story turns. Because instead of disappearing into anonymous labor, he appears in law enforcement records. Reports describe multiple arrests in the late 1980s and early 1990s, property crimes, weapons-related issues, and drug charges. Then, a more serious case. A federal narcotics matter in the early 1990s connected to heroin trafficking allegations. We should be cautious with details here, because different reports summarize the case differently. But the broad picture is consistent. He served time in the United States, and prison, especially in the era of expanding drug markets, can become a kind of criminal university. Not just punishment, but networking, exposure, learning who controls what, and what the market demands. When he was released, reports say he was deported back to Mexico in the mid-1990s. That's a key moment. Because the man returning to Mexico wasn't the same teenager who left a rural community behind. He had seen the scale of the U.S. drug market and what it could fund. Back in Mexico, the drug world was transforming. Cartels were no longer just smugglers. They were becoming governing forces, taxing, extorting, policing, and punishing. Some reporting claims Nemesio briefly worked in local policing in Jalisco. Not all sources agree on the specifics, and public documentation is limited, so treat this as reported, not absolute fact. Still, the concept matters. Because if you understand law enforcement routes, response times, command structures, you can build criminal operations that avoid detection. At some point, by most accounts, he fully entered organized crime. And one name keeps appearing in the background: the Michoacán cartel. In western Mexico, the Michoacán organization was connected to the Valencia family network, and it worked within a shifting ecosystem of alliances, especially with elements tied to the Sinaloa cartel. Here, El Mencho's rise wasn't only about violence. It was about relationships, trust, family ties. Reports say he married Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, linking him to a powerful clan. In cartel dynamics, marriages can be more than personal bonds. They can be strategic bonds. And as the 2000s approached, the pieces were set for an explosion. In cartel history, the arrest of a leader rarely ends a criminal organization. It often does something worse. It creates a vacuum. In the early 2000s, key figures linked to Michoacán structures were arrested. Power shifted. Rivals pressured territories. And as Mexico's broader drug war intensified, groups that once focused on trafficking began fighting for local control streets, ports, highways, towns. One of the most feared forces in that era was Los Zetas, known for brutal tactics and territorial aggression. In several accounts, pressure from Zetas and internal cartel conflicts created the conditions for a new type of group to emerge. In this environment, El Mencho's name appears increasingly in reports describing a capable enforcer and organizer. Not just a trigger puller, but someone able to manage people, logistics, and money. And then another name enters the story: Ignacio Nacho Coronel. Coronel was widely described as a key methamphetamine figure associated with Sinaloa's network. Accounts say El Mencho aligned with Coronel during a period when alliances mattered as much as bullets. But alliances in the underworld are temporary by design. And by 2010, the scene was about to fracture again. Cartels used to hide, but in the late 2000s and early 2010s, something changed. Groups began to brand themselves. They issued statements. They produced propaganda. They tried to sell themselves as protectors against worse criminals while committing their own violence. Out of this era came a label that shook Western Mexico: Los Mata Zetas, the Zeta Killers. In many accounts, this faction presented itself as a force against extortion and terror associated with rivals. But the deeper reality, according to prosecutors and analysts, was a violent struggle for territory and power. This is also where CJNG begins to take shape. Sources generally describe CJNG as emerging around 2010 from splintering networks in western Mexico, seizing a moment when older structures weakened. Think of it like an earthquake. When a cartel's leadership cracks, new groups rush into the cracks fast, aggressive, and hungry. And El Mencho, according to U.S. and Mexican authorities, became the central leader of this new organization. The name they chose carried a message: Jalisco New Generation Cartel. New generation, new rules, new level of violence. To understand why CJNG terrified both rivals and authorities, you have to understand how it operated. Many older cartels relied heavily on quiet corruption and slow expansion. CJNG, by contrast, developed a reputation for speed, moving into regions quickly, striking hard, and using intimidation to establish control. It wasn't just about trafficking routes. It was about local power. Who controls the police chief? Who controls the mayor? Who controls the road at night? Authorities and analysts often described CJNG as having a paramilitary style: training, coordinated operations, uniform-like gear and propaganda imagery, and the willingness to confront the state more directly than many groups dared. That willingness became famous in one moment that shocked the nation. In 2015, CJNG was linked to a wave of coordinated violence in Jalisco, and during that chaos, a military helicopter was brought down. We will not describe tactical methods or how it was done, but the impact was undeniable. The message to the Mexican state was simple: we can hit you. From that point forward, CJNG's reputation hardened, not merely as traffickers, but as an armed force with political impact. In the 1990s, cocaine symbolized cartel power. But in the 2010s, the world shifted into the age of synthetics. Unlike plant-based drugs, synthetic drugs can be produced anywhere, scaled rapidly, and adapted to demand. Authorities allege this transformation supercharged cartels like CJNG. Government statements and court filings in the United States increasingly tied CJNG to major flows of methamphetamine and fentanyl. And the U.S. fentanyl crisis changed the stakes. Because fentanyl is not only profitable, it's lethal. Small doses can kill. And in public health terms, it created a wave of overdoses that made cartel trafficking an international emergency, not just a crime problem. As CJNG grew, investigators described an organization with regional commanders, financial managers, smuggling coordinators, enforcement teams, and corruption networks. At the top, according to U.S. and Mexican authorities, was El Mencho, a man portrayed not as a celebrity trafficker, but as a disciplined fugitive. Some reporting suggests he avoided flashy displays, that he preferred rural hideouts and constant movement, that he relied on trusted security, sometimes described as ex-military personnel. Whether every detail is true or not, the pattern is believable. As pressure increases, kingpins either become louder or they become invisible. By the late 2010s and into the 2020s, El Mencho had become one of the most wanted men in the hemisphere. The United States issued indictments alleging drug trafficking and weapons-related crimes. U.S. agencies publicly identified him as the leader of CJNG. And then came the reward: up to $15 million offered by the U.S. government for information leading to his arrest and conviction. Rewards like that do two things: they encourage betrayal, and they increase paranoia. To survive, a fugitive at that level must reduce exposure to almost zero. No phones, no predictable travel, no new faces, and a security circle so tight it becomes a prison of its own. Sanctions expanded, to targeting networks, associates, and financial arteries. Because modern cartel power is not just guns, it's money, real estate, businesses, front companies. But despite years of pressure, he remained free. And that impossible fact, the most wanted man still alive, still hidden only, enlarged the legend. When a kingpin becomes a symbol, the truth becomes foggy. For years, rumors swirled: he's sick, he's dying, he's dead. Some rumors claimed respiratory collapse, others claimed hidden medical crises, others said authorities were hiding the truth. But in the absence of official confirmation, these claims remained exactly what they were: rumors. And rumors have a purpose in cartel culture. They confuse enemies. They test loyalty. They create noise that makes real intelligence harder to find. Sometimes rumors also comfort people who want the nightmare to end. Because if the villain is dead, maybe the violence ends too. But Mexico's history shows a darker truth. When one leader falls, another rises, or the organization fractures, and violence multiplies. So by early 2026, the world was in a familiar place, a kingpin myth, a cartel still powerful, and a question hanging in the air: will the state ever reach him? Then, on February 22, 2026, major outlets reported a dramatic development. According to Mexico's defense ministry, El Mencho was killed in a military operation in Jalisco. Reports placed the operation in the region of Tapalpa, while some accounts mentioned Talpa de Allende. Early reporting in fast-moving events can contain location inconsistencies, but the central claim was the same. Authorities said the fugitive was finally down. Accounts described a firefight. El Mencho gravely wounded and later dead. But the story didn't end with an announcement, because within hours, CJNG's reaction according to reporting was immediate and visible. Roadblocks appeared, vehicles burned across highways, movement was disrupted, fear spread fast. In cartel logic, retaliation has multiple goals: to punish the state, to project strength, to remind everyone that even if the leader falls, the organization still bites. For ordinary people, families, workers, students, this kind of backlash is not politics. It is terror. It is being trapped on roads with nowhere to go. It is watching smoke columns rise and wondering if you can make it home. Authorities framed the operation as a major victory, and by any measure, removing the alleged leader of CJNG would be historic. But history also warns us: decapitation doesn't guarantee dismantling. So who was El Mencho? To some, he was a myth, an invisible kingpin blamed for endless violence. To authorities, he was the alleged architect of one of the most aggressive cartels in Mexico. To rivals, he was a threat. To communities caught in the middle, he was a name attached to fear. His rise followed a pattern we've seen again and again. Poverty creates vulnerability. Migration creates exposure. Prison creates networks. Cartel fragmentation creates opportunity. And the synthetic drug era creates massive, fast money. But if you zoom out far enough, this is not just a cartel story. It's a demand story, because for every shipment seized, someone still wants what's being sold. It's a corruption story, because for every gunman on a road, there is often an official who looked away. And it's a governance story, because cartels thrive where the state cannot fully protect people, deliver justice, or build opportunity. If El Mencho is truly dead, the next chapter won't be written by him. It will be written by whoever tries to inherit his empire, and by whether institutions can prevent that empire from regenerating. Because the most dangerous truth about cartel leadership is this: a kingpin can be killed, but the system that creates kingpins is harder to defeat. In the mountains, the helicopters eventually leave, the smoke clears, the roads reopen. And then the question returns, quietly like it always does: who's next?